Chapter 21, Part 1 of The Three Hostages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 21, How I Stalked the Wilder Game Than Deer. 9 a.m. to 2:15 p.m. Obviously, I could make no plan, and I had no clear idea in my head as to what kind of settlement I wanted with Medina. I was certain that I should find him somewhere on that hill, and that, if he got a chance, he would try to kill me. The odds were, of course, against his succeeding straight off, but escape was not what I sought. I must get rid of this menace forever. I don't think that I wanted to kill him, but indeed, I never tried to analyze my feelings. I was obeying a blind instinct and letting myself drift on the tides of fate. Quarry Nadside is an upper quarry, separated from the Asil valley by a curtain of rock and scree, which I dare say was once the moraine of a glacier, and down which the Alt na Sidhe tumbled in a fine chain of cascades. So steep its fall is that no fish can ascend it, so that while at the foot it is full of a sizable trout, in the quarry itself it holds nothing, as Greenslade reported, but little dark fingerlings. It was very warm as we mounted the chaos of slabs and boulders, where a very sketchy and winding track had been cut for the bringing down of the deer. Only the toughest kind of pony could make that ascent. Though the day was young, the heat was already great, and the glen behind us swam in a glassy sheen. Kennedy, as usual, mopped his brow and grunted, but the lean Angus strode ahead as if he were on the flat. At the edge of the quarry we halted for a spy. Deep hollows have a trick of drawing the wind, and such faint currents of air as I could detect seemed to be coming on our own left rear from the northeast. Angus was positive, however, that though the south had gone out of the wind, it was pretty well due east, with no north in it, and maintained that when we were farther up the quarry we would have it fair on our left cheek. We were not long in finding beasts. There was a big drove of hinds on the right bank of the burn, and another lot, with a few small stags on the left bank, well up on the face of Bechain Falda, but there was nothing shootable there. "The big stags will be on all the high tops," said Angus. "We must be getting up to the burn head." It was easier said than done, for there were the hinds to be circumvented, so we had to make a long circuit far up the hill called Clonlet, which is the westernmost of the Macrae tops, south of Asil. It was rough going, for we mounted about 3,000 feet level, and traversed the hillside just under the upper scarp of the rock. Presently we were looking down upon the cup, which was the head of the quarry, and over the cool could we see the peak of Staub Quarry Assain, and the ridge of the Sob Ban, both on Haripole and beyond the Rescule. We had another spy, and made out of 2 small lots of stags on the other side of Alt na Sidhe. They were too far off to get a proper view of them, but 1 or 2 looked good beasts, and I decided to get near. We had to make a cautious descent of the hillside in case of deer lying in pockets, for the place was seamed with gullies. Before we were halfway down, I got my telescope on one of the lots and picked out a big stag with a poor head, which clearly wanted shooting. Angus agreed, and we started down a sheltering ravine to get to the burn side. The sight of the quarry made me forget everything else. For the next hour and a half I hadn't a thought in the world except how to get within range of that beast. One stalk is very much like another, and I am not going to describe this. The only trouble came from a small stag in our rear, which had come over Clunlet, and got the scent of our track on the hill face. This unsettled him, and he went off at a great pace towards the top of the burn. I thought at first that the brute would go up to Blenheim and carry off our lot with him, but he came to a halt, changed his mind, and made for the Harepool march in the Col. After that it was plain sailing. We crawled up the right of the Alt na Sihid, which was the first-class cover, and then turned up a tributary gully, which came down from Blenheim. Indeed, the whole business was too simple to be much of interest to anyone, except the man with the rifle. When I judged I was about the latitude of my stag, I crept out of the burn and reached a hillock from which I had a good view of him. The head, I suspected, was poor, only 9 points, though the horns were of rough, thick old Highland type, but the body was heavy, and he was clearly a back-going beast. After a wait of some 20 minutes, he got up and gave me the chase of about 200 yards. I dropped him dead with a shot in the neck, which was the only part of him clear. It was for me the first stag of the season, and it is always a pleasant moment when the tension relaxes and you light your pipe and look around you. As soon as the walk was over, I proposed lunch, and we found for the purpose a little nook by a spring. We were within a few hundred yards of Harepool Marsh, which does not run along the watershed, but crosses the quarry about half a mile below the Col. In the old days of sheep there had been a fence, the decaying post of which could be observed a little way off on the knoll. Between the fence and the Col lay some very rough ground, where the Alt na Sihid had its source, ground so broken that it was impossible, without going a good way up the hill, to see from it the watershed ridge. I finished Mary's stuffing scones and ginger biscuits, and had a drink of whiskey and spring water, while Angus and Kennedy ate their lunch a few yards off in the heather. I was just lighting my pipe when a sound made me pause, with the match in my hand. A rifle bullet sang over my head. It was not very near, 50 feet or so above me, and a little to the left. "The tamed tourists," I heard Angus exclaim. I knew it was Medina, as certainly as if I had seen him. He was somewhere in the rough ground between the Harepool Marsh and the Col, probably close to the Col, for the sound of the report seemed to come from a good way off. He could not have been aiming at me, for I was perfectly covered, but he must have seen me when I stalked the stag. He had decided that his chance was not yet come, and the shot was camouflage to keep up the reputation of Harepool for wild shooting. "It would be the staggy that went over the march," grunted Angus. "The tourists to be shooting at such a wee beast." I had suddenly made up my mind. I would give Medina the opportunity he sought. I would go and look for him. I got up and stretched my legs. "I am going to stalk on my own," I told Angus. "I'll go over to the quarry Isan. You had better pull this beast down to the burn side, and then fetch the pony. You might send Hughie and the other pony up to Glenisal to the mad burn. If I get a stag, I'll grolock him and get him down somehow to the burn. So tell Hughie to look out for my signal. I'll wave a white handkerchief. The wind is backing round to the north, Angus. It should be all right for Corry Isan if I take it from the south. That would be better for Sugdearg, said Angus, but that's o'er far. Have you the cartridges, sir? Plenty, I said, patting a side pocket. Give me that spare rope, Kennedy. I'll want it for hauling down my stag if I get one. I put my little 240 into its cover, nodded to the men, and turned down the gully to the main burn. I wasn't going to appear on the bare hillside, so long as it was possible for Medina to have a shot at me. But soon a ridge shut off the view from the Harepool ground, and then I took a slant up the face of Buchan Fada. Mary had spent most of the morning at the big telescope in the library window. She saw us reach the rim of the quarry and lost us when we moved up the side of Clonlet. We came into view again far up the quarry, and she saw the stalk and the death of the stag. Then she went to luncheon, but hastened back in the middle of it to see me scrambling alone among the screes of Blenheim Fada. At first she was reassured because she thought I was coming home, but then she realized that I was mounting higher and making for Corry Isan. Her heart sank, and when I had gone out of view, she could do nothing but range miserably about the garden. 2:15 to about 5 p.m. It was very hot on Blenheim Fada, for I was out of the wind, but when I reached the ridge and looked down on Corry Isan, I found a fair breeze, which had certainly more north than east in it. There was not a cloud in the sky, and every top for miles round stood out clear, except the Harepool peaks, which were shut off by the highest of the ridge I stood on. Corry Isan lay far below, not a broad cup like Corry Nasid, but a deep gash in the hills. I inclined at such an angle that the stream in it was nothing but white water. We called it the Mad Burn. Its Gaelic name, I think, was the Alt Almuhulan, and halfway up was just opposite me a tributary. The Red Burn came down from the cliffs of Sugdearg. I could see the northern peak of that mountain, a beautiful cone of rock rising like the Matterhorn from the glacis of Secree. I argued that Medina would have seen me going up Blenheim Fada and would assume that I was bound for Corry Isan. He would recross the Col and make for the Harepool side of the Galach, which led from the quarry to the Rescue. Now I wanted to keep the higher ground, where I could follow his movements. So it was my aim to get the watershed ridge, looking down on Harepool before he did. The wind was a nuisance, for it was blowing from me and would move any deer toward him, thereby giving him a clue to my whereabouts. So I thought if I could once locate him, I might try to get the lee side of him, and that time I think I had a vague notion of driving him towards Macrae. I moved at my best pace along the east face of Blenheim Fada towards the Blee Leach, which was a deep rift in the grey rock curtain through which deer could pass. My only feeling was excitement, such I had never known before any stalk. I slipped and sprawled among the slabs, slithered over the secrees, had one or two awkward traverses round the butt end of the cliffs, but in 20 minutes I was at the point where the massif of Blenheim Fada joined the watershed ridge. The easy way was now to get on the ridge, but I dared not appear on the skyline, so I made a troublesome journey along the near side of the ridge wall, sometimes out of the face of the sheer precipices, but more often involved a chaos of loose boulders which were the debris of the upper rocks. I was forced pretty far down, and eventually struck the beach patch about 500 feet below the summit. At the crest I found I had no view of the Rescue Valley, only a narrow quarry blocked by the shoulder of a hill, and the bald top of Staub Quarry as seen beyond. A prospect I must have, so I turned east along the watershed ridge in the direction of Sogdier. I was by this time very warm, for I had come at a brisk pace. I had a rifle to carry, and had Angus's rope around my shoulders like a Swiss guide. I was wearing an old grey suit, which, with bluish stockings, made me pretty well visible on that hill side. Presently I mounted the ridge, keeping the course under the skyline. I came to a place where a lift of the rocks enabled me to clear the spurs and command a mile or so of Rescue. The place was on the skyline, bare and exposed. I crawled to the edge where I could get a view. Below me, after a few hundred yards of rocks and scree, I saw a long track of bracken and deep heather sweeping down to the stream. Medina, I made sure, was somewhere thereabouts, watching the ridge. I calculated that, with his recrossing of the Col at the head of the Quarry Nassid, and his working around the south end of the Benenfada, he could not have had time to get down to the beach, or near the beach, before me. I must still be on the lower ground. Indeed, I hoped to catch sight of him, for, while I was assured he was pursuing me, he could not know that I was after him, and might be off his guard. But there was no sign of life in that sunny stretch of green and purple, broken by the grey of boulders. I searched it with my glass, and could see no movement except pipits and a curlew by a patch of bog. Then it occurred to me to show myself. He must be made to know that I had accepted this challenge. I stood up straight on the edge of the steep, and decided to remain standing till I had counted 50. It was an insane thing to do, I dare say, but I was determined to force the pace. I had got to 41 without anything happening. Then a sudden instinct made me crouch and step aside. That movement was my salvation. There was a sound like a twanged fiddle string. A bullet passed over my left shoulder. I felt the wind of it on my cheek. The next second I was on my back, wriggling below the skyline. Once there I could get to my feet and run up the ridge on my left to get a view from higher ground. The shot was, so far as I could judge, had come from well below, and a little to the east where I had been standing. I found another crunkle of rock, and crept to the edge of it, so that I looked from between two boulders to the glen. The place was still utterly quiet. My enemy was hidden there, probably not half a mile off, but there was nothing to reveal his presence. The light wind stirred the bog cotton. A Maryland sailed across to Staub Quarry as seen. A raven croaked in the crags, but these were the only sounds. There was not even a sign of deer. My glass showed that halfway down an old ewe was feeding. one of those melancholy beasts which stray into the forest from adjacent sheep ground, and lead a precarious life among the rocks, lean and matted and wild, till some gilly cuts their throats. They are far sharper eyed and quicker of hearing than a stag, and an unmitigated curse to the stalker. The brute was feeding on a patch of turf near a big stretch of bracken, and suddenly I saw her raise her head and stare. It was the first time I had ever felt well disposed towards a sheep. She was curious about something in a shallow gully which flanked the brackens, and so was I. I kept my glass glued on her, and saw her toss her disreputable head, stamp her foot, and then heard her whistle through her nose. This was a snag Medina could not have reckoned with. He was clearly in that gully, working his way upward in its cover, unwitted that the ewe was giving him away. I argued that he must want to reach the high ground as soon as possible. He had seen me on the ridge, and must naturally conclude that I had beaten a retreat. My first business, therefore, was to reassure him. I got my rifle out of its cover, which I stuffed into my pocket. There was a little patch of gravel just on the lip of the gully. I calculated that he would emerge beside it, under the shade of a blaeberry-covered stone. I guessed right. I saw first an arm, then a shoulder part the rushes, and presently a face which peered uphill. My glass showed me that the face was Medina's, very red and dirty from contact with the peaty soil. He slowly reached for his glass and began to scan the heights. I don't know what my purpose was at the time, if indeed I had any purpose. I didn't exactly mean to kill him. I think, though I felt it might come to that. Vaguely I wanted to put him out of action, to put the fear of God in him, and make him come to terms. Of further consequences I never thought, but I had one clear intention, to make him understand that I accepted his challenge. I put a bullet neatly into the center of the patch of gravel, then got my glass on it. He knew the game all right. In a second, like a weasel, he was back in the gully. I reckoned that now I had my chance. Along the ridge I went, mounting fast, and keeping always below the skyline. I wanted to get to the lee side of him, and so be able to stalk him upwind, and I thought that I had an opportunity now to turn the head of the rescue by one of the sheep quarries which descend from Sir Dirk. Looking back, it all seems very confused and amateurish, for what could I hope to do, even if I had the lee side, beyond killing or wounding him? But I had a chance of that as long as I had the upper ground. But in the excitement of the chase, the mind does not take long views, and I was enthralled by the crazy sport of the thing. I did not feel any fear, because I was not worrying about consequences. Soon I came to the part of the ridge, and saw frowning upon me the great rock face of Sogdir. I saw, too, a thing I had forgotten. There was no way up the mountain direct from the ridge, for the tower was perpendicular as a house wall. To surmount it, a man must traverse on one side or the other, on the Macrae side by a scree slope, or on the Harepool side by a deep gully, which formed the top of the quarry to which I was now looking. Across that quarry was the first of the great buttress which Sir Deer sends down to Rescuel. It was the famous Pinnacle Ridge, as the mountaineers called it. I had climbed it 3 weeks before, and found it pretty stiff. And then I had kept the ridge all the way from the valley bottom, and I did not see any practicable rode up to the quarry face of it, which was nothing but slabs and rotten rocks, while the few chimneys had ugly overhangs. I lay flat and reconnoitered. What was Medina likely to do? After my shot, he could not follow up the ridge. The cover was too poor on the upper slopes. I reasoned that he would keep on the broken ground up by the glen till he reached this quarry, and try to find a road to the high ground either by the quarry itself or by one of the spurs. In that case, it was my business to wait for him. But first I thought I had better put a fresh clip in my magazine, for the shot I had fired had been the last cartridge in the old clip. It was now that I made an appalling discovery. I had felt my pockets and told Angus that I had plenty of cartridges. So I had, but they didn't fit. I remembered that 2 days before I had lent Archie my .240, and he had been shooting with a Mannlicher. What I had in my pocket were Mannlicher clips left over from that day. I might chuck my rifle away, for it was no more use than a poker. At first I was stunned by the fatality. Here was I engaged in a duel on a wild mountain with one of the best shots in the world, and I had lost my gun. The sensible course would have been to go home. There was plenty of time for that, and long before Medina reached the ridge I could be in cover in the gorge of the Mad Burn. But that way out of it never occurred to me. I had chosen to set the course, and the game must be played out here and now. But I confess that I was pretty well in despair, and could see no plan. I think I had a faint hope of protracting the thing till dark, and then trusting to my hill craft to get even with him. But I had an unpleasant feeling that he was not likely to oblige me with so long a delay. I forced myself to think, and decided that Medina would either come up to the quarry or take the steep spur which formed the right-hand side of it and ran down to the Rascule. The second route would give him cover, but also render him liable to a surprise at close quarters if I divined his intention, for I might suddenly confront him 4 yards at the top of one of the pitches. He would therefore prefer the quarry, which was magnificently broken up with rocks, steamed with ravines, and at the same time gave a clear view of all the high ground. With my face in a clump of loose wort, I raked the place with my glass, and to my delight saw a deer feeding about halfway down in the right-hand corner. Medina could not ascend the quarry without disturbing these deer, a batch of some 30 hinds with 5 small and 2 fair stags among them. Therefore I was protected from that side, and had only the ridge to watch. But as I lay there, I thought of another plan. Medina, I was pretty certain, would try the quarry first, and would not see the deer till he was well inside it, for they were on that kind of platform which hid them from below. Opposite me, across the narrow quarry, rose the great black wall of the pinnacle ridge, with the wind blowing from me towards it. I remember a trick which Angus had taught me, how a stalker might have his wind carried against his face of an opposite mountain, and then, so to speak, reflected from it, and brought back to his own side, so that deer below him would get it and move away from it upward towards him. If I let my scent be carried to the pinnacle ridge and divert it back, it would move the deer on the platform up the quarry towards me. It would be a faint wind, so that they would move slowly away from it, no doubt, towards a gap under the tower of Sogdier, which led to the little quarry at the head of the red burn. We never stalked that quarry, because it was impossible to get a stag out of it without cutting him up, so the place was a kind of sanctuary to which disturbed deer would naturally resort. I stood on the skyline, being confident that Medina could not be yet within sight, and let the wind, which was now stronger, nearly due north, ruffle my hair. I did this for about 5 minutes, then lay down to watch the result. With my glass on the deer, presently I saw them become restless. First the hinds, and then the small stags lift their heads, looking towards Pinnacle Ridge. Soon a little fellow trotted a few yards uphill, and then a couple of hinds moved after him, and then by a sudden and simultaneous impulse, the whole party began to drift up the quarry. It was a quiet, steady advance, and they were not scared, only a little doubtful. I saw with satisfaction that their objective seemed to be the gap which led over the red burn. Medina must see this, and would assume that wherever I was not ahead of the deer. He might look for me on the other side, but more likely would follow the beast so as to get the high ground. Once there, he could see my movements, whether I was on the slopes of the Pinnacle Ridge or down the Macrae side. He would consider, no doubt, that his marksmanship was so infinitely better than mine that he had only to pick me out of the landscape to make an end of the business. What exactly I intended to do, I did not know. I had a fleeting notion of lying hidden and surprising him, but the chances against that were about 1,000,000 to 1, and even if I had got him at close quarters, he was armed and I was not. I moved a little to the right, so as to keep my wind from the deer, and waited with a chill beginning to creep over my spirit. My watch told me it was about 5 o'clock. Mary and Peter John would be having tea among Prince Charlie roses, and Greenslade and Archie coming up from the river. It would be heavenly at Macrae, now among greenery and the cool airs of the evening. Up here there was loveliness enough, from the stars of the butterwort and the grass of the Paranus by the wellhead to the solemn tops of Sogdir, the colour of the stormy waves against a faint turquoise sky. But I knew now that the beauty of the earth depends on the eye of the beholder, for suddenly the clean airy world around me had grown leaden and stifling. End of Part 1, Chapter 21. Chapter 21, Part 2 of The Three Hostages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Three Hostages by John Buchan. Part 2, 5 p.m. to about 7:30 p.m. It was a good hour before he came. I had guessed rightly. He had made the deduction I was hoping for. He was following the deer toward the gap, assuming I was on the Macrae side. I was in a rushy hollow at a junction of the main ridge of the spur I have mentioned. I could see him clearly as, with immense circumspection, in the use of every scrape of cover, he had made his way up the quarry. Once he was over the watershed, I would command him from higher ground and have the wind to my advantage. I had some hope now, for I ought to be able to keep him on the hill till the light failed, when my superior local knowledge would come to my aid. He must be growing tired, I reflected, for he had far more ground to cover. For myself, I felt that I could go on forever. That might have been the course of events, but for a second sheep. Sogdir had always been noted for possessing a few sheep, even on its high rocks. Infernal, tattered outlaws, strays originally from some decent flock, but now, to all intents, a new species, unclassified by science. How they lived and bred I knew not, but there was a legend of many a good stock ruined by their diabolical cunning. I heard something between a snort and a whistle behind me, and screwed my head around, and saw one of these confounded animals poised on a rock and looking my direction. It could see me perfectly, too, for on that side I had no cover. I lay like a mouse watching Medina. He was about half a mile off, almost on top of the quarry, and had halted for a rest and a spy. I prayed fervently that he would not see the sheep. He heard it. The brute started its whistling and coughing, and a novice could have seen that it suspected something and knew that something was. I observed him get his glass on my lair, though from the place where he was he could see nothing but rushes. Then he seemed to make up his mind suddenly and disappeared from view. I knew what he was after. He had dropped into a scar which would take him to the skyline and enable him to come down on me from above, while he himself would be safe from my observation. There was nothing to do but to clear out. The spur dropping to the rescue seemed to me the best chance, so I started off, crouching and crawling, to get round the nose of it and on the steep glenward face. It was a miserable job, till I had turned the corner, for I expected every moment a bullet in the back. Nothing happened, however, and soon I was slithering down awesome slabs to an insecure ledge of heather. I am a fairly experienced mountaineer, a lover of rock, but I dislike vegetation mixed up with a climb, and I had too much of it now. There was perhaps 1,000 feet of that spur, and I think I must hold the speed record for its descent. Scratched, bruised, and breathless, I came to an anchor on the bed of skis, with the infant rescue tumbling below me and beyond it, a quarter-mile off, the black cliffs of the Pinnacle Ridge. But what was my next step to be? The position was reversed. Medina was above me with a rifle, and my own weapon was useless. He must find out the road I had taken, and would be after me like a flame. It was no good going down the hill. In the open ground he would get the chance of 20 shots. It was no good sticking to the spur or the adjacent ridge, for cover was bad. I could not hide for long in the quarry. Then I looked to the Pinnacle Ridge, and considered that, for once I got into those dark coilers, I might be safe. The psalmist had turned to the hills for his help. I had better look to the rocks. I had a quarter-mile of open to cross, and a good deal more if I was to reach the ridge at a point of easy ascent. There were chimneys in front of me, deep black gashes, but my recollection of them was that they had looked horribly difficult, and had been plentifully supplied with overhangs. Supposing I had got into one of them and stuck, Medina would have me safe enough, but I couldn't wait to think, with an ugly cold feeling in my stomach. Supposing I got into one of them and stuck, Medina would have me safe enough, but I couldn't wait to think, with an ugly cold feeling in my inside. I got into the ravine of the burn, after a long drink from the pool. I started downstream, keeping close to the right-hand bank, which mercifully was high and dotted with rowan saplings, and as I went, I was always turning my head to see behind and above me what I feared. I think Medina, who of course did not know about my rifle, may have suspected a trap, for he came on slowly, and when I caught sight of him, it was not on the spur. I had descended but farther up the quarry, Two things I now realized. One was I could not make the easy end of the pinnacle ridge without exposing myself on some particularly bare ground. The other was that to my left in the ridge was a deep gully which looked climbable. Moreover, the foot of that gully was not 100 yards from the burn, and the mouth was so deep that a man could find shelter as soon as he entered it. For a moment I could not see Medina. I don't think he had yet caught sight of me. There was a trickling of water coming down from the gully to the burn that gave me an apology for cover. I ground my nose into the flow moss and let the water trickle down my neck as I squirmed my way up, praying hard the enemy's eyes might be sealed. I think I had got about halfway when a turn gave me a view of the quarry, and there was Medina halted and looking towards me. By the mercy of Providence my boots were out of sight, and my head a little lower than my shoulders, so that I suppose, among the sand and the gravel and rushes, I must be hard to detect. He had used his telescope. I think he must have spotted me, though I'm not certain. I saw him staring. I saw him half raise his rifle to his shoulder, while I heard my heart thump. Then he lowered his weapon and moved out of sight. 2 minutes later I was inside the gully, the place like a cave with a sandy floor, and then came a steep pitch of rock, while the sides narrowed into a chimney. This was not very difficult. I swung myself up into the second stowey, and found that the cleft was so deep that the back wall was about 3 yards from the opening, so that I climbed in almost complete darkness and in complete safety from view. This went on for about 50 feet, and then, after a rather awkward chalkstone, I came to a fork. The branch on the left looked homeless, while that on the right seemed to offer some chances. But I stopped to consider, for I remembered something. I remembered that this was the chimney which I had prospected 3 weeks ago, before when I climbed the pinnacle ridge. I had prospected it from above, and had come to the conclusion that, while the left fork might be climbed, the right was impossible, or nearly so, for modestly as it began, it ran out into a fearsome crack on the face of the cliff, and did not become a chimney again till after 100 feet of unclimbable rotten granite. So I tried the left fork, which looked horribly unpromising. The first trouble was a chalkstone, which I managed to climb around, and then the confounded thing widened and became perpendicular. I remembered that I had believed a way could be found by taking to the right-hand face, in an excitement of the climb. I had forgotten all precautions. It simply did not occur to me that this face route might bring me in sight of the eyes which at all costs I must avoid. But it was not an easy business, for there was an extreme poverty of decent holds. But I have done worse pitches in my time, and had I not had a rifle to carry, I had no sling, might have thought less of it. Very soon I was past the worst, and saw my way to returning to the chimney, which had once more become reasonable. I had stopped for a second to prospect my route, with my foot on a sound ledge and my right elbow crooked round a jag of rock, and my left hand, which held the rifle, stretched out so that my fingers could test the soundness of a certain hold. Suddenly I felt the power go out of those fingers. The stones seemed to crumble, and splinter flew into my eye. There was a crashing of echoes, which drowned the noise of my rifle as it clattered down into the precipice. I remember looking at my hand spread eagle against the rock, and wondered why it looked so strange. The light was beginning to fail, so it must have been 7:30, 7:30 and onwards. Had anything of the sort happened to me during an ordinary climb, I should beyond doubt have lost my footing with the shock and fallen. But being pursued, I suppose my nerves were keyed to a perpetual expectancy, and I did not slip. The fear of a second bullet saved my life. In a trice, I was back in the chimney, and the second bullet spent itself harmlessly on the granite. Mercifully, it was now easier going, honest knee and back work, which I could manage in spite of my shattered fingers. I climbed feverishly with a cold sweat on my brow, but every muscle was in order, and I knew I could make no mistake. The chimney was deep, and the ledge of rock hid me from my enemy below. Presently I squeezed through a gap, swung myself with my right hand and my knees to a shelf, and saw that the difficulties were over. A shallow gully, filled with screes, led up the crest of the ridge, and was the place I had looked on 3 weeks before. I examined my left hand, which was a horrid mess. The top of my thumb was blown off, and the 2 top joints of my middle and third fingers were smashed to a pulp. I felt no pain in them, though they were dripping blood, but I had a queer numbness in my left shoulder. I managed to bind the hand up in the handkerchief, where it made a gory bundle. Then I tried to collect my wits. Medina was coming up the chimney after me. He knew I had no rifle. He was, as I had heard, an expert cragsman, and he was the younger man by at least 10 years. My first thought was to make for the upper part of the pinnacle ridge, and try to hide or elude him somehow till the darkness. But he could follow me in the transparent northern night. I must soon weaken from loss of blood. I could not hope to put significant distance between us for safety, and he had his deadly rifle. Somewhere in the night, or in the dawning, he would get me. No, I must stay and fight it out. Could I hold the chimney? I had no weapons but stones, but I might be able to prevent a man ascending by those intricate rocks. In the chimney, at any rate, there was cover, and he could not use his rifle. But would he try the chimney? Why should he go round by the lower slopes of the pinnacle ridge and come up from above me? It was the dread of his bullets that decided me. My one passionate longing was for cover. I might get him in a place where his rifle was useless, and I had a chance to use my greater muscular strength. I did not care what happened to me, provided I got my hands on him. Behind all my fear and confusion and pain, now there was a cold flurry of rage. So I slipped back into this chimney, and descended to where it turned slightly to the left past a nose of rock. Here I had cover. I could peer down into the darkening depths of the great lower. A purple haze filled the quarry, and the macrame tops were like dull amethysts. The sky was a cloudy blue, sprinkled with stars, and mingling with the last flush of sunset was the first tide of the afterglow. At first all was quiet in the gully, and I heard the faint trickling of stones, which are always falling in such a place, and once the croak of a hungry raven. Was my enemy there? Did he know of the easier route up the pinnacle ridge? Would he not assume that if I could climb the cleft he could follow? And would he feel any dread of a man with no gun and a shattered hand? Then far below came a sound I recognized. Iron hobnails on rock. I began to collect loose stones and made a little pile of such ammunition beside me. I realized that Medina had begun the ascent of the lower pitches. Every breach in the stillness was perfectly clear, the steady scraping in the chimney, the fall of fragment of rock as he surmounted the lower chalk stone, the scraping again as he was forced out onto the containing wall. The light must have been poor, but the road was plain. Of course I saw nothing of him, for the bulge prevented me, but my ears told me the story. There was silence. I realized that he had come to the place where the chimney forked. I had my stones ready, for I had hoped to get him when he was driven out on the face at the overhang, the spot where I had been when he fired. The sounds began again, and I waited in a desperate, choking calm. In a minute or two would come the crisis. I remember that the afterglow was on Macquarie tops. It made a pale light in the quarry below. In the cleft there was still a kind of dim twilight. Any moment I suspected to see a dark thing in movement 50 feet below, which would be Medina's head. But it did not come. The noise of scraped rock still continued, but it seemed to draw no nearer. Then I realized that I had misjudged the earlier situation. Medina had taken the right-hand fork. He was bound to, unless he had made, like me, an earlier reconnaissance. My route in the half-lit light must have looked starkly impossible. The odds were now on my side. No man, in the fast-gathering darkness, could hope to climb the face of the cliff and rejoin that chimney after its interruption. He would go on till he struck, and then it would not be too easy to get back. I reascended my own cleft, for I had a notion that I might traverse across the space between the two forks and find a vantage point of view. Very slowly and painfully, for my left arm was beginning to burn like fire on my left shoulder and neck, to feel strangely paralyzed. I wriggled across the steep face till I found a sort of guinarme of rock, beyond which the cliff fell smoothly to the lip of the other fork. The great gully below was now a pit of darkness, but the afterglow still lingered on this upper section, and I saw clearly where Medina's chimney lay, where it narrowed and where it came out. I fixed myself so as to prevent myself from falling, for I feared that I was becoming light-headed. Then I remembered Angus's rope, got it unrolled, and took a coil around my waist, and made a hitch over the guinarme. There was a smothering cry from below, and suddenly came the ring of metal on stone, and then a clatter of something falling. I knew what it meant. Medina's rifle had gone the way of mine, and lay now among the boulder at the chimney foot. At last we stood on equal terms, and befogged as my mind was, I saw that nothing now could stand between us and a settlement. It seemed to me that I saw something moving in the half-light. If it was Medina, he had the left chimney, and was trying the face, the way I knew there was no hope. He would be forced back, and surely would soon realize the folly of it and descend. Now that his rifle had gone, my hatred had ebbed. I seemed only to be watching a fellow mountaineer in a quandary. He could not have been 40 feet from me, for I heard his quick breathing. He was striving hard for holds, and the rock must have been rotten, for there was a continuous dropping of fragments, and once a considerable boulder hurtled down the quayer. "Go back, man," I cried instinctively. "Back to the chimney. You can't get further that way." I suppose he heard me, for he made a more violent effort, and I thought I could see him sprawl at a foothold, which he was missing, and then swing out on his hands. He was evidently weakening, for I heard a sob of weariness. If he could not regain the chimney, there was 300 feet of a fall to the boulders at the foot. "Medina," I yelled, "I have a rope. I'm going to send it down to you. Get your arm in the loop." I made a noose at the end with my teeth and my right hand, working with a manic's fury. "I'll fling it out straight," I cried. "Catch it when it falls to you." My cast was good enough, but he let it pass. The rope dangled down to the abyss. "Oh, damn it, man," I roared. "You can trust me. We'll have it out when I get you safe. You'll break your neck if you hang there." Again I threw, and suddenly the rope tightened. He believed my word, and I think that was the greatest compliment ever paid me in all my days. "Now you're held," I cried. "I got a belay here. Try and climb back into the chimney." He understood and began to move, but his arms and legs must have been numb with fatigue, for suddenly that happened which I feared. There was a wild slipping and plunging. Then it swung out limply, missing the chimney, right on the smooth wall of the cliff. There was nothing for it but to haul him back. I knew Angus's ropes too well to have any confidence in them, and I only had one good hand. The rope ran through a groove of stone which I had covered with my coat, and I hoped to work it even with a single arm by moving slowly upwards. "I'll pull you up," I yelled, "but for God's sake give me some help. Don't hang on the rope more than you need." My loop was a large one, and I think he had got both arms around it. He was a monstrous weight, limp and dead as a sack, for though I could feel him scraping and kicking at the cliff face, the rock was too smooth for fissures. I held the rope with my feet, planted against boulders, and wrought till my muscles cracked. Inch by inch I was drawing him in, till I realized the danger. My rope was grating on the sharp brink beyond the chimney. It might at any moment be cut like a knife's edge. "Medina!" My voice must have been like a wild animal's scream. "This is too dangerous. I'm going to let you down a bit so that you can traverse. There's a sort of ledge down there. For heaven's sake, go canny with this rope." I slipped the belay from the gendarme, and hideously difficult it was. Then I moved farther down to a little platform near the chimney. This gave me about 60 extra yards. "Now," I cried, when I had to let him slip down, "a little to your left. Do you feel the ledge?" He had found some sort of foothold, and for the moment there was a relaxation of the strain. The rope swayed to my right toward the chimney, and I began to see a glimmer of hope. "Cheer up," I cried. "Once in the chimney you're safe. Sing out when you reach it." The answer out of the darkness was a sob. I think giddiness must have overtaken him, or that atrophy of muscle which is the peril of rock climbing. Suddenly the rope scorched my fingers, and a shock came on my middle, which dragged me to the very end of the abyss. I still believe that I could have saved him if I had the use of both my hands, for I could have guided the rope away from the fatal knife edge. But I knew it was hopeless. But I put every ounce of strength and will into the effort to swing it with its burden to the chimney. He gave me no help, for I hope that he was unconscious. Next second the strands had parted. I fell back with a sound in my ears which I pray God I may never hear again, the sound of a body rebounding dully from crag to crag, and then a long, soft rumbling of screes like a snow slip. I managed to crawl the few yards to the anchorage of the Glenarme before my senses departed. There, in the morning, Mary and Angus found me. End of Chapter 21, Part 2, and end of The Three Hostages by John Buchan.